what better place than the Cato Institute to talk about the very opposite of the values it cherishes, namely the systematic violence and calculated terror of the first years of the regime in China. I'm particularly honored because this is the Friedrich Hayek Auditorium. And had Hayek not written a book in 1947 called The Road to Freedom, The Road to Serve Them, that's very much the title that I would have used for this one. By 1956-57, that road to serve them has been pretty much fully traveled in China. And that's the topic of the book. Let me talk about this very briefly. I'm hesitant to walk around as I normally do with a clip-on microphone because I know there is a camera in the back and that person will become very annoyed if I do so. So I'll just stay here. But let me in about half an hour talk briefly about the key points of the book. In 2006, I read a newspaper article in which it was reported that construction workers in Changchun, a city all the way up north in China, in a region formerly known as Manchuria, had made a ghastly discovery. They were digging, and in that rich black soil of Manchuria, they stumbled upon thousands of skeletons very closely packed together. The residents gathered around the excavated area and wondered, could these be the victims of the Japanese occupation of the city during the Second World War? One elderly man realized that they just stumbled upon the remnants of the Civil War. In 1948, the communist troops had laid siege to the city, unable to defeat it, that starved it into submission. In the process, at least 160,000 civilians also starved to death. After decades of propaganda about the peaceful liberation of the People's Republic, few people remember the victims of the rise to power of the Chinese Communist Party. Let me step back, and why don't we start on the 6th of August, 1945. Hiroshima, erased in the blinding flash of light. 2 days later, Stalin declares war on Japan, keeping to a promise he had made earlier to Roosevelt and Churchill at the Yalta Conference. The Americans gave him plenty of help to do so, at least 600 ships of Lend-Lease materials sent to Siberia. So even in the race to reach Berlin and occupy half of Europe, Stalin managed to keep his army in Siberia almost 1 million strong. Manchuria is occupied within days. But even after the capitulation of Japan, the Soviets do not leave. They stay on till April 1946. They hand over the countryside to Mao Zedong and his ragtag army of guerrilla fighters. They establish 16 military institutions. Some Chinese officers go to Moscow for advanced training. Logistical help arrives by train, by air, by sea. From North Korea alone, 2,000 wagon loads are allocated to the task. And in the meantime, the Americans become so disillusioned with the nationalists, and Chiang Kai-shek in particular, that they stop their deliveries of armaments. In September 1946, Truman imposes an arms embargo. But Chiang Kai-shek, rightly or wrongly, believes that he cannot possibly keep hold of China without controlling Manchuria. So he keeps on pouring his very best government troops into that region. And again, his best armies are defeated by Mao Zedong, as Mao Zedong has been able to turn that ragtag army into a formidable fighting machine involved in a war of attrition against the enemy, the nationalists. By 1948, the communist troops advanced towards Changchun. Lin Biao encircles the city But when he realizes that the nationalist garrison stationed inside will not capitulate, he orders the city to be starved into submission. 160,000 people die. Zhang Zhenglong, a lieutenant of the People's Liberation Army who later on documented the siege, compared it to Hiroshima. He said Hiroshima took 9 seconds, Changchun took 5 months, but the number of victims was pretty much the same, 160,000 civilians. Once Changchun is gone, other cities are besieged. Beijing, unwilling to undergo the same fate, surrenders. One after the other, cities tumble from Beijing all the way south to Canton or Guangzhou. By the end of 1949, the nationalists flee to Taiwan, never to return. What happens with liberation? Well, in every town conquered by the People's Liberation Army, liberation is celebrated with a very carefully choreographed procession. Soldiers open the parade, followed by a truck with a portrait of Mao Zedong, and dancers waving red flags, moving their bodies to the music played by heavy waist drums, gongs, trumpets. It's a fanfare. After the celebrations, come the police. They are less friendly. Within cities like Beijing, Shanghai, special teams trained to take over public security arrive within days of liberation. But on the whole, whether it's in the police station or the post office, city hall, government servants, civil servants, are asked by the communists to stay on and help the new regime. After all, they can't run a country of that size. Well, the police, who stay on, do the rounds and try to ferret out forbidden items, which range from radios to weapons. But most of all, they classify everybody in these cities and assign them a class label, a chengfan. There are bad classes, revolutionary soldiers, good classes, revolutionary soldiers, factory workers. There are middle classes, intellectuals, and bad classes. These encompass capitalists and landlords. All of them are asked to go and transform themselves into new people in schools. All of them have to learn the new ideology. From Beijing all the way south to Guangzhou, cities become giant adult education centers, except for a few at the very bottom of the hierarchy: paupers, prostitutes, beggars, but also millions of refugees and disbanded soldiers are sent to the countryside, which becomes the great dumping ground of all undesirable elements. Some of these cities, bustling Shanghai, for instance, become pale shadows of their former selves. Foreigners leave in droves. Shanghai, which at that time was half again as big as Moscow, had a larger foreign population than any city on planet Earth except for New York, and more foreign investment than either Paris or London, becomes a dying city within months. Unemployment rockets, international trade comes to a halt, shops shutter at 6 p.m, a curfew is imposed. Further up north, Tianjin also slips into slow decay. But how about the countryside? I've talked about the cities. Let us go back to the countryside, where liberation very much starts with something that has been referred to as land reform, quote unquote. It starts very much in Manchuria in 1947. It's done round about 1952 at the very latest. Some places undergo the process of land reform twice. Let me focus on one small village called Yuanbao, all the way north of Manchuria. In 1947, special teams arrive into this village of 700 people. They try to find out what the power structure is. Who are the elected village leaders? Who are the people who carry credibility? And bit by bit, they try to pent up local grievances and polarize this village into two opposites: a majority, the people, and the carefully targeted number of victims referred to as landlords, tyrants, traitors. After months of very patient work, the militia arrive, seal off the village. Everybody has to wear a strip of cloth. The poor, or those labeled poor, wear a red strip of cloth. Those seen to be landlords have to wear a white piece of cloth. These victims are rounded up into cowsheds. One by one, they're dragged out onto a stage, struggled by the farmers, assembled in their hundreds, mocked, humiliated, denounced, and eventually killed. Some 73 people in this village of 700 are violently killed. Their assets distributed to the others. The land paced, measured, distributed, furniture lugged away, grain loaded into baskets, pigs driven along. Nobody here has the opportunity to somehow stand back on the sidelines. Farmers who do not participate in these violent denunciation meetings are themselves denounced as people who are shielding landlords. Mao manages to compel everybody to denounce each other. The result is that in this village and elsewhere, everybody has blood on their hands. The pact between the poor and the party is sealed in blood. Enough blood must be shed in order for a return to the old regime to become impossible. Violence is intrinsic to this revolution. It is not a byproduct. The villagers themselves have to get rid of their own leaders. Yuan Bo was very violent, but take Hubei, where a whole county is bloodied, according to Liu Shaoqi himself, who writes in 1947 that people are being dismembered, buried alive. Xi Zhongxun, father of a man referred to today as Mr. Xi, he runs the country, I believe, reports from Shanxi that even the children of people labeled as landlords are persecuted as little landlords. How many victims? Very difficult to say, but by 1952, 10 million people have been expropriated. 40% of the land has changed hands. Some 1.5 to 2 million people have died violently in the process. Might people be allowed to get on with it? By the end of 1950 or so, 1 year after liberation? Not quite. On the 18th of October 1950, some 200,000 troops cross into Korea and start fighting the American troops a few days later. Mao uses the Korean War as a pretext to regiment his own society. He launches a campaign of terror. He has a directive in which he says that counter-revolutionaries, spies, bandits, remnant nationalist troops must be liquidated. And how is he going to do that? Well, like steel production and grain output, death came very much with a quota mandated from above. The chairman believes that 1 per 1,000 in the entire population should be publicly executed. But of course, he's not alone. Before you know it, there are willing executioners on the ground, trying to outdo each other, comparing how many people they kill, and sometimes afraid of being seen as lagging behind. Villages compete with villages, counties and counties. By 1950 and 51, in a province like Guizhou, up to 3 per 1,000 people are being killed. And then ordinary people themselves, in a very fractured society, use the terror to settle their own accounts, to pursue their own personal vendettas. Take one example, or two. The first one from Yanqing County in Yunnan, a wealthy region covered in salt fields, where on the basis of one anonymous denunciation that reaches the headquarters of the party, over 100 school children are arrested in 1951. Wu Lianying, aged 10, is hung from a beam and he's beaten. Ma Zedong, aged 8, has his knees crushed on a concrete floor. A 6-year-old is accused of being the head of a spying squad. 2 of these students are tortured to death. You might think, well, that seems exaggerated. But this is the beauty of the party archives, in which I have worked to come up with the evidence for this book. There's profuse, detailed evidence about what happened. Reports by the secret police, bean counters who add up how many people were killed, investigations, you name it. So this was not an isolated example, not far away from where I live in Hong Kong. Across the border in Guangdong province is a Luoding County where 340 school children were arrested on the mere suspicion of one case of theft. In that entire province, up to 1/3 of all the people killed during this campaign of terror, up to 1/3 of all those victims are judged at the time by the regime to be innocent according to their own standards. And then something else is happening. On the cover of these public executions, which are supposed to reflect the wrath of the people, verdicts are given by people's tribunals in cities. People have to attend them in stadiums, in the countryside, the public village square. They must witness these executions. But on the cover of all that, local cadres pursue their own little personal vendettas. People are killed secretly, covertly, alone or in batches, along rivers, near ravines, deep inside the forest. In one town called Maogong in Sichuan, some 10 people are officially denounced as counter-revolutionaries, shot in public. Over 100 are covertly assassinated. How many? Very difficult to say, but when this campaign of terror comes to an end in October 1951, according to one report, which the Minister of Public Security wrote himself and sent to Mao Zedong, the total reaches 301,800 for a mere 6 provinces. Bo Yibo, father of another man we've heard of recently, Bo Xilai, puts the number of people killed during that campaign at roughly 2 million. So now we are at the end of 1951. Might this be the end of the terror? Might this be the start of an era of peace and social stability? Again, not quite. Mao Zedong turns his attention towards the very ranks of the party itself. He believes that there are local cadres who have become corrupt. Many cases are discovered as cadres turn against each other and start denouncing themselves. 2 high-ranking party officials are executed in Hebei. They're shot in the heart, not in the head, as a concession to their rank. But something else is happening on the cover of popular support for a few highly publicized cases of corruption within the party. All those civil servants, government employees who had been asked to stay on by the communists in 1949 and even promised the protection and gratitude of the party are no longer needed. A good million of them are quietly dismissed, many of them sent to the Gulag. And even before this campaign against corruption in the party has ended, Mao shifts its attention again towards another group of people. Already in January 1952, there are dark hints about malevolent, evil outside forces undermining public morality. It's not that cadres are corrupt, they've been made corrupt. Mao Zedong says that the bourgeoisie has been waging a savage offensive, quote unquote, against the party. But entrepreneurs, businessmen are already reeling from 3 years of communism. Everything that stood between them and the state has already been eliminated. But it's not enough. So the very techniques fine-tuned during land reform are now being replicated inside factories and enterprises in the cities. As managers, business people, shopkeepers are dragged out one after the other, made to confront the workers, assembled to denounce them. Some of these entrepreneurs turn against each other, driven by sheer fear, trying to save themselves. Again, no adequate numbers, but in Shanghai alone, some 644 people commit suicide within 2 months alone. That's about 10 a day. If you try to jump from windows, but the police have erected nets around some of these skyscrapers, so they go all the way up to the roof and take running jumps. Again, we will not know how many victims there are, but this campaign is also followed by something else, an attempt at thought reform. As all those so-called middle classes, those intellectuals and professionals, have to declare their loyalty to the party. We're only in 1952. I still have to talk a little bit about what happens from 1953 to 1957. We don't have much time, so let me focus on two key events that take place, both of them triggered by events in Moscow. The first one you can guess. It happens in March 1953. The old man himself dies. Stalin is gone. But Stalin was the only one person powerful enough to somehow restrain Mao. The Stalin who had urged him to be a little bit easier on those rich farmers in 1949 and 50. It was Stalin who had told Mao to slow down the pace of collectivization in 1952. Now that his master in Moscow was gone, Mao could forge ahead with collectivization. Already by the end of 1953, the party imposes a monopoly on the grain, which means, in effect, that the villagers have to sell the grain they produce to the state at state-mandated prices in state-managed shops. A year and a half later, Zhou Enlai, enlightened as ever, imposes an internal passport system derived from the Soviet Union and referred to as the household registration system onto farmers in the countryside, meaning that they are now tied to the land. They cannot leave these collectives and try to find work elsewhere in the cities. And by 1955 and 56, giant state farms have appeared, so that many, but not all, of these farmers have become, in effect, bonded servants of the state, serfs. The road to serve has been fully traveled for many of them. The land belongs to the state, not to them. Their tools are to be shared. Their work schedules determined by local cadres who decide who should do what for how many work points. Same thing in the cities. Our commerce and industry by early 1956 have become functions of the state, from small shopkeepers to larger industrialists who are promised also protection against interference by the party, have to hand over their assets to the state. Many do so with a big smile because they realize that that's their only chance to actually keep a job in what is now state-owned and once belonged to them. There is, by 1956, massive discontent. And this we know because of a second event triggered by Moscow. This one happens in February 1956, when Khrushchev denounces his former master, Stalin, for having presided over a regime of suspicion, fear, terror. Khrushchev even denounces the state farms that Stalin had imposed on the farmers. Mao sees it as a personal affront. He, after all, is, if not the new Stalin, certainly the Stalin of China. Some of his colleagues, Zhou Enlai, Liu Shaoqi, use it to slightly slow down the pace of collectivization. It takes Mao 2 months to come up with an answer. In April 1956, he gives a speech to an enlarged meeting of the Politburo entitled On the 10 Great Relationships. I'm not going to bore you with this speech, but it is a major accomplishment. In this speech, Mao poses as the champion of the ordinary man, a protector of democratic values. He reclaims moral leadership over the party and the communist camp as a whole by outdoing Khrushchev. 2 months earlier, he had looked like an aging dictator, out of touch with reality, clinging to an outdated program of collectivization. Now he, rather than Khrushchev, comes across as the man who strikes the truly liberal tone. A week later, Mao urges the party to accept more freedom among people. He urges 100 flowers to bloom, 100 schools to content. And content people do. We knew that many intellectuals spoke out later on. I'll come to that in a minute. But workers go on strike as never before. Some 30,000 people on strike in Shanghai, a small city like Xi'an, 40 cases of strikes by workers and students. And farmers themselves use this to leave the collectives in droves. Just across the border from Hong Kong, in some of these villages in Guangdong, up to a third of the farmers forcibly take back the land they believe is theirs and start planting crops that they think might actually work a lot better than what they've been ordered to do by the local cadres. Still, intellectuals are prudent. They've had about 5 years of thought reform, and many of them have been sent away already to the Gulag. But Mao encourages them in February 1957. Speak out. Be frank. There's a torrent of criticism. Some people compare Mao to the Pope. Many clamor for democracy, human rights. There are demands that the Communist Party actually step down. Mao is stung by the criticism, is very badly miscalculated. He turns around, puts a tough little man called Deng Xiaoping in charge of a so-called anti-rightist campaign, during which some 500,000 people are labeled as rightists, meaning counter-revolutionary, many of them shipped off to the Gulag. By the end of 1957, every opposition to Mao and the party has been crushed. By 1957, every promise that Mao had made to come to power, like Lenin and the Bolsheviks 30, 40 years earlier, has been broken. Minorities were promised independence. Workers were promised better working conditions. The farmers, the land. Intellectuals, freedom of speech. Entrepreneurs were told that their private property would be protected. Every promise has been broken. By the end of 1957, Mao is prepared to start a whole new experiment in communism. It's called the Great Leap Forward. And that's a story for a different day. Thank you.